How well does a 5.7 liter Hemi respond to camshafts, cylinder heads, and boost? Let's find out. In this video, we'll find out just how well an early Gen 3 5.7 liter Hemi responds to performance mods. You know, like a camshaft, ported cylinder heads, even an intake manifold. Just to spice things up, we're going to throw in some boost. The Gen 3 Hemi actually has a lot in common with the LS motor, and for good reason. I mean, they're marketplace competitors. They were both offered in similar displacements and similar power outputs, but there's more to it than that. If you take a look at an LS motor, it has really good cylinder heads and really good intake manifolds right from the factory. And this is especially true of the later LS3 version. Now the Gen 3 Hemi is the same way. Even the early 5.7 liter like we had has really good cylinder heads on, especially if you compare it to the LA and Magnum heads that came before it. Now, that 5.7 liter Hemi also has very good intake manifolds right from the factory. Whether you choose a truck manifold, a Magnum, or the aluminum SRT8, they all perform very well. And the later, larger Hemis perform even better. So let's take a look and see how well this Hemi responded to ported heads, a wilder camshaft, a single plane intake, and heck, just to spice it up, we threw on a TorqStorm supercharger. To get things started, we wanted to run a stock motor up on the dyno, so we purchased a 2005 5.7 liter Hemi motor from a local dismantler. It had it shipped over to Westech. We quickly disassembled everything, meaning we took all the front accessories off and we installed an electric water pump. We put it up on the dyno and ran it with a Holley HP management system. The engine was also configured with a set of long tube headers feeding 3-inch exhaust. It had an open throttle body, so no air intake or anything. And we had to convert the throttle body. We had to convert it to drive-by-wire. I'm using air quotes there that you can't see. Because it had an electronic throttle body. It had so we had to convert that. What we did was we just cut the guts out of it, grabbed the shaft, the throttle shaft with a set of vice grips, and then used a piece of baling wire to pull the vice grip back and forth. I hooked up a little homemade return spring so that it would return, and everything worked out great. So we tuned that thing with the Holley HP management system, ran it with the long tube headers and no accessories. And let's take a look at the power output of our basically Junkyard 5.7. Then we'll show you what happens when we applied all the modifications. So here's what happened when we installed our 5.7 liter Hemi up on the dyno. It was run with long tube headers and the Holley HP management system, meaning we could dial in the air, fuel, and timing curves perfectly. Unlike some of the factory stuff, obviously in the trucks it's pretty mild. This is run with that open throttle body and no accessories, just a Mazir electric water pump. So equipped like that with the factory, you know, throttle body, intake, camshaft heads, all that stuff. Kind of the way it came from the wrecking yard. This thing had about 127,000 miles on it, I think. So this factory motor, 5.7 liter, produced 383 horsepower at 5,400 RPM. And since these things were designed for torque, obviously the torque was higher than the horsepower. Produced 419.8 foot-pounds of torque, so around 420 foot-pounds. We've run a few of these, and they all kind of seem to be in this range. We've had some be a little bit lower. I think some of them been as low as 365 or 370. The torque always kind of seems to be there, depending on, you know, how well they were treated and whether the guy changed the oil, maintained it at all. But this one was a pretty good one, had a nice curve. So we had a good baseline here. Now we were going to take a look and see what happens after we made all the modifications. We're going to add the Comp 273 cam, a set of ported heads, and that Mopar Performance, basically 4-barrel or single plane intake manifold, which is not quite as good as this long runner one at producing torque, but it will allow the motor to rip. Let's find out what happened. I know this is kind of the scary effects here. I'm running out of light, so I'm filming with a light and it's aimed at me and it looks kind of dumb, I know, but that's okay, we'll get past it. So after running our 5.7 liter early 5.7 Hemi, we, in stock trim, we made the modifications to it. Now actually we made all the modifications at once, and normally I would do them one at a time, but this was actually not even my motor. It belonged to my good buddy Steve Dulcich, so I borrowed his motor with all the modifications on it. And what we did, he had done a Comp Extreme Energy camshaft, and at the time it was the biggest one that they offered. I think it was a 273. And I'll go ahead and put the cam specs up here so you guys can take a look at them. He also had a set of heads, the factory heads, ported, which they did a nice job on, and we put the ported heads on there. The other modification that was made, and I did this specifically because we were going to be running a centrifugal supercharger on it, and a centrifugal supercharger adds boost with RPM, so we wanted to run a little bit more RPM with this thing. So on this motor that I borrowed from Steve, he had a single plane Mopar performance intake manifold on it. And I've run a bunch of tests with that in my book on Gen 3 Hemi stuff. And it's not great, but it does make a pretty decent peak power. And again, it allowed us to run more RPM with the centrifugal supercharger. So let's take a look at the power output of that NA, and then we'll take a look and see what happens when we added our TorqStorm supercharger. Now that we've run our 5.7 liter in stock trim with the long tube headers, let's take a look and see what happens after we applied the comp cam and the ported heads and that single plane Mopar performance intake manifold. So let's take a look at that. So as we can see, we had a big change in the power curve. So where the stock motor was making 383 horsepower, 419 foot-pounds, the interesting thing is that the peak torque didn't change dramatically. All we did was extend it out quite a bit. This thing made 400, the modified version made 423 foot-pounds of torque. And we were at about 419, 420 with the stock, but at a much lower RPM, and this thing shifted it out by, you know, almost 2,000 RPM. The net result was a much higher power peak, so we're looking at 515 horsepower, 514.6 horsepower, all the way out at 7,000 RPM. As I said, that single plane manifold definitely wants to allow the motor to rev. Combine that with a camshaft with wilder cam timing, and then ported heads. Those things all combine together to allow the motor to rev and to make power at a much higher RPM. But as you can see, if we look down low, kind of where the torque peak was here in 4,300 or so, where the torque peak was for the factory combination, we did see a slight loss in torque. And that's a combination of a couple things. I honestly don't think that the heads probably hurt it at all, but the camshaft will soften the bottom end up a little bit, but that single plane intake will definitely drop torque down there. I've run that test, just a comparison between that intake manifold and a factory truck or a Magnum intake, and it's always the same. It's that way with a single plane on anything, on an LS or a small block Chevy, big block Chevy, whatever it is. It always tends to lose power down low, and this is no exception. But we had a secret weapon here. The reason that we did that was so that we could put the centrifugal supercharger on, and instead of, like on the factory one, shutting off and having the power roll over up to 5,500, now we can continue to rev the thing. And since the centrifugal blower adds power and boost with RPM, we're hoping good things will happen. Let's find out. As you can see, the gains that, or the modifications that were made to that 5.7 liter made a big difference. I mean, that was a pretty big jump in power going from our factory fresh, and by factory I mean junkyard fresh, 5.7 liter, and then with the modifications of the comp cam and the ported heads and that Mopar performance intake, although it does give away a lot of torque in the middle part of the curve, all the way kind of up till the end compared to a good Magnum or SRT8 intake. But either way, it revved out there pretty good, out to 7,000 or so. So it did good. The combination did good. It made over 500 horsepower, which was nice. So now let's take a look and see what happened when we installed the TorqStorm supercharger. Okay, after running our modified version of the 5.7 liter Hemi, this is our stock one here. As you remember, this is our modified version. So we were excited about installing the supercharger on it. We had a TorqStorm supercharger, and here's what happened after we installed the TorqStorm. as you can see, as we come to expect from boost, from almost anything, whether it's a positive displacement blower, centrifugal, or turbos, whatever. Big changes in power, and this thing just kind of elevated the whole curve here, kind of followed the shape of the new curve, and it did well. The only problem we had is I would love to have run this thing like successfully out to 7,000 RPM, which we weren't able to do because at the top we kept running into belt slippage issues, which we tried to solve in a variety of different manners. But I think the ideal thing is, you know, maybe a brand new belt or maybe a 10-rib pulley setup or something. But this is one of the clean runs we got, and it worked out really well. Equipped with the TorqStorm supercharger, it made 677 horsepower, so it was up 150 horsepower or so. Yeah, more than that, 155 horsepower, 160 horsepower. So we got good gains from the little TorqStorm. It worked good. And there's probably more, you know, there's probably more available. As I said, on other applications, we've run this on an LS and a small block Chevy and other combinations, and we've actually made over 700 horsepower with it. It works good. So we know that there's a little bit more left, but we just, you know, we were excited about doing the Hemi, and we were excited about adding boost to it. The TorqStorm supercharger was easy to bolt on, so that was not a problem at all. And we used the carburetor hat that they supplied with their kit to bolt it right onto that 4150 4-hole throttle body that we ran on that single plane intake. So all that worked out great. So we were actually pretty excited about this. This combination worked good. Going from the stock motor to the modified motor and then to the boosted motor worked out good. Shows that the Hemi definitely respond to all of the usual array of performance modifications: cams, heads, intakes, and obviously boost. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, what did you think? Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of the Hemi. I'm also a big fan of the LS and Honda B-Series VTEC motors and rotaries and big blocks, really almost anything I can get on the dyno I just love, because I like seeing what it was before, and then and even more so, I like seeing what it was after we made the modifications. And that's exactly what happened here. I like seeing the Hemi. I'm glad that we finally got one. We got it up on the dyno, ran a bunch of testing with it, and I used it for my book. But I like seeing what it did after we made the modifications, that it did indeed respond to that stuff. And I like seeing what it did with the supercharger. So all of that's good. I wish we wouldn't have had quite as many belt issues as we had. The TorqStorm stuff we've used on a bunch, and it works really well. I just like to see, I think maybe we were trying to push it a little bit too hard on this application, and I'd like to see what would happen if we could really spin that supercharger all the way out. Now, we've made over 700 horsepower with it, so we know it's capable of doing that. I just like to see what would happen if we had maybe, you know, a 8-rib, 10-rib kind of upgrade deal on it. But it worked out just fine, and it shows that the Gen 3 Hemi does respond to all the usual performance modifications, and there's plenty of power there. All you have to do is go find it. And guess what? Now there are even better cams than that 273 cam offered by Comp Cams. So that's stuff to look forward to. I'm going to do some more testing with that. I'm Richard Holder. Thanks for watching, guys. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I'll keep the videos coming.